Hey, welcome back to another episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we are going to talk about some simple formulas to figure out your sashing and border calculations. Now, you might have your own way to kind of come up with these quantities that you need, but I see this a lot with the clients that I work with. A lot of times people will kind of miscount or have a little bit of an issue depending on the size that results in an error, right? You don't have enough pieces cut or you have too many pieces cut, which is not a great situation to be in. So what I'm going to talk you through today are a couple of formulas that will work for any size depending on what you're working with and will always give you the correct quantities so that you never have those errors. With sashing pieces in particular, a lot of people will actually just sit there and count them because there's not really an obvious way to kind of figure out the quantities for these things by just looking at it for most people. It requires a little bit more digging to get there, and a lot of people just don't do that. And anytime you're just kind of counting things, very, very prone to errors, which is obviously what we want to avoid. So I'm going to show you a couple of quick formulas that will always get you to the right number. So let's talk first about kind of a row column block layout where you've got sashing completely surrounding the block. So there is actually a sashed border surrounding the edge of this quilt, right? The blocks just don't go to the edge of the fabric with the sashing just inside. We'll talk about that case in a minute. If you're in this particular instance, you're going to have a number of rows and a number of columns. That's pretty easy to determine by just looking at the layout of the quilt. So in that case, the number of sashing pieces that you need is going to be 2 times your rows times your columns, right? So if you have 5 rows like we do in this particular instance and 4 columns, the number of sashing pieces that you're going to need is going to be 2 times 4 times 5, 40, right? And then we kind of have to do a little bit of a correction for the end pieces, and we do that by just adding an additional set of rows and columns, right? So it's going to be 2 times rows times columns plus rows plus columns. So in this particular instance, we already said the first part of that was 40, and then I'm going to add another 5 rows. So we're up to 45, and then another 4 columns. So we're up to 49. And that if you go through and count each of these little sashing pieces that we see on our diagram over here, you will find out that that is exactly 49 pieces. Easy. Let's talk about those cornerstone pieces. So that's the little gray squares that go in between. The number of cornerstone pieces for this particular kind of layout is going to be your rows plus 1 times your columns plus 1. So again, in this particular instance, we have 5 rows. So 5 plus 1 is 6, and then we're going to multiply that by columns plus 1, which is 4 plus 1 or 5. So here we're going to have 6 times 5, which is 30, and you need 30 cornerstone pieces. And again, if you go through and count all these things, you'll find that that equals exactly to 30. Not too difficult. Okay, let's move on to the case that you don't have a sash border. So you still have your sashing in the middle, but the border isn't the final thing on the exterior part of those rows. You have blocks that go all the way to the edge of your quilt, and you're going to add a border or something along those lines there. So in this particular instance, the formula is slightly different, right? We don't have that sashing border going all the way around our quilt center in this case. And so the number of sashing pieces that you need is going to be 2 times your rows times your columns. But in this case, we're going to subtract the number of rows and columns at the end rather than adding them. So again, 2 times 4 times 5, 2 times rows times columns is 40 in this particular instance. And then we're going to subtract the number of rows, which in this case is 5, and then subtract the number of columns, which in this case is 4. So we're going to subtract 4 and 5, basically 9, from 40. So in this case, it's 31 pieces. Again, if you go through and count all of those pieces, you will find that it equals exactly 31. For the cornerstones, it's a similar formula again, only the pluses that we had in the previous formula are now minuses, similar to what we saw before. So we're basically going to multiply the number of rows minus 1 times the number of columns minus 1. So columns, we have 4 columns, so I'm going to subtract 1 from that, that's 3. And we have 5 rows, take away 1, that's 4. So we're going to be multiplying 4 times 3, that equals 12. And if you count those cornerstone pieces, you'll easily see that that equals 12 pieces. Pretty simple once you just kind of work from a formula rather than trying to count everything. It's one thing you can always count on. The math will always work out right as long as you have the formula correct. Okay, so that's it for kind of sashing pieces. We're not going to talk about diagonal layouts, on-point layouts, which are a completely different beast. That'll be a different video at some point in the future. But we do need to talk about border calculations and some best practices surrounding that because I see a lot of different ways to do this. Okay, so if you're talking about whole border pieces, right, you're going to add a complete strip to each side and then a complete strip to the top and bottom. The best way that I have found to do this and that I recommend to most of my clients is actually to just kind of sum up all of those lengths that you need and divide it by the width of fabric minus your seam allowance, right? The reason for that is because that's how you're going to save the most fabric. A lot of people tend to want to do like sew together 2 pieces and then sew that to your side of your quilt and trim it flush. And then you're going to do that on the other side, right? And then you're going to do that top and do that to the bottom. And so you end up with basically 8 width of fabric strips when you might only need 6 or 7. And then your customer has these like odd length pieces of fabric that were trimmed off that they can't really use for anything. And it's just very wasteful, especially if you're doing a 6 or 8 inch border. Those are really large pieces of fabric. So what I always recommend is just sew one big long strip end to end, right? And then cut your border sections from there so you can minimize the amount of fabric that you're using. Obviously a little bit more difficult to do if you're doing a mitered border, but the principle still remains. You just need to add a little extra there for all of your mitered joins. So the way that this looks for a quilt like this, where you need basically 2 73-inch pieces and 2 58-inch pieces, right? The longer pieces for the sides and the shorter pieces for the top and bottom, you would have an instruction in your cutting instructions to just say, cut some number of strips, sew them end to end or lengthwise, whichever terminology you prefer, and then subcut 2 of this dimension and 2 of that dimension, and then it's done. Right? You have your border pieces and you don't have a whole lot of extra fabric just kind of sitting around in these trimmings that aren't really useful. Now, worth noting is that you do have to subtract that seam allowance, right? When you're making kind of perpendicular joins on the end of each of your strips, you are going to be losing that 1/2 inch of seam allowance. And if you don't account for that, especially with much, much bigger pieces on the queen and king sizes, this is going to get exaggerated and you might not have enough fabric, which would not be good, right? So you always want to subtract that seam allowance before you divide by kind of the available strip width. If you're doing diagonal joins, I'm going to drop a link to a video about calculating binding widths and how that's done, because it's done very similar for a binding join. There's basically an extra amount of fabric that you need to account for because you're losing more to that kind of diagonal join. Same thing for mitered corners. You need a little bit extra fabric, and that needs to go into the calculation before you kind of divide and figure out how many strip widths you need. But if you're just doing a standard 1/2 inch seam, this is going to basically be 41.5. That's the number that you're going to divide by if you're using a 42-inch width of fabric in order to get the total number of strips that you need to cut in order to have enough. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe. Now, worth noting, if all of this math just feels like a lot going on, a little bit overwhelming to you, I do have a tool specifically built for that reason. It is called Mathless Quilts. It is an online web app that allows you to do all of this quilt math calculation super easily. You don't have to rely on knowing any of the math yourself. You just input the shapes and elements in your quilt, and it will spit out optimized cutting instructions and fabric requirements for you pretty much instantly. It's pretty cool. So I will drop the link to that in the description below. I will see you next week for another episode of Tech Tip Tuesday.